ghetto. But if I said, oh, so when was that? Oh, I don't want to talk about it. Very, very occasionally. But he used to come to everything we did. He always wanted to be, but he couldn't. And he became, to represent for myself and those who work with me, representative of so many of them who could not and did not talk about it.
Talk about it, yeah.
They just couldn't. And it took
especially
me a while.
Around my children.
Yeah.
Especially when the children were around.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think they were protective of their children as
very,
well.
very much so.
You know, I think that was partly why we began to get the stories from them, because we were sort of outside of it. So we were, I'm not saying they offloaded, but they told us a lot of things. And I don't think it was a secrecy in that sense, but I think some of the material was and still is very difficult. It's not the type of thing you would share with.
No.
I wouldn't share things of mine, you know, something you don't share with your children. You can protect your family.
And yet he was a child himself. He was like 8 years old when the whole thing, and he was pretty much on his own.
Oh, it's the youngsters, the younger ones, the very young ones. There's some very young ones, as young as 3 years old, came to Windermere. And Sir Ben Helfgott often said to me that they probably had a much tougher time of it in later life than the boys did, than the older ones, because he said we could remember and we could support each other, but the youngsters had they were sort of a blank canvas. They didn't know anything. Yeah. They didn't know anything, and he said that was difficult for them. So yeah, it's amazing to hear this thing survived. You know, we get some drawings have survived from Windermere that the children did, but they fetched up in an archive in the US.
Where are they? Where are they drawings?
It's the US Library of Congress. It's a straight. They were, believe it or not, guys, they were exhibited in MoMA in New York in '47.
47. That's very interesting. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, we're kind of investigating the journey of them, because a lot of the trails run cold, but we're sort of beginning to build a picture of how they survived and why. And unfortunately, they don't have many names attached to them. Some do, but we kind of, so it just doesn't close down. It's sort of, you know, it just. Some
of the founders of MoMA were art dealers, Jewish art dealers from Germany.
This is what we want to explore. There will be a connection through.
Definitely.
For those the carers who came to look after the children in Windermere, there is a definite connection with the Freud family and with Anna Freud. Who fetched up in London and set up a special sort of nursing care for children damaged in the war. And although we knew that she cared for, or she studied some of the younger ones, it's amazing how many of the carers, the volunteers, the students, all came through that sort of nursery connection. So you normally find that there are connections. When you sort of drill down, you find out how did this happen? You sort of, and it's a lot of the time it's people fleeing, you know, fleeing Austria and Germany in the 30s, and that they brought with them. I mean, the Britain and the States, we sort of got the very best, the most advanced psychologists, psychiatrists. We sort of inherited it all here.
Not all
the network, and they're all in Windermere, which is strange for us to think of. You know, a funny little village in the back of Beyond. You know, I'll talk a little bit about that later. Yeah.
Thanks. It's wonderful when the questions and the answers begin even before the presentation. But, you would think that Trevor has been speaking to us for a long time already, but he hasn't. So what I'm going to do is actually begin. I'm going to mute everyone first, so that. For the next little while, and then we'll come back for more conversation. So please hold on while I mute you. I want to welcome everybody to Temple Beth Israel virtually this morning in Waltham, Massachusetts. I'm Mark Friedenberg, the president of the synagogue, and as you figured out, Trevor Avery is our guest today. Before we get started, I'll invite Rabbi David Finkelstein to say a few words of welcome.
Thank you, Mark. I'm Rabbi David Finkelstein, the Rabbi of Temple Beth Israel, and I've been in Temple Beth Israel this is my 7th year now, and I've been getting to know Mark over that time, and also had the great privilege of getting to know Bernie Freidenberg a bit, when he would come to Temple Beth Israel, and I got to know his story a little bit in 2018, along with other members of Temple Beth Israel, when Bernie told his story back then, and also spent some time with Phyllis, and it's great to be with Phyllis Freidenberg as well. As Mark already said, Trevor Avery is our special guest, and welcome, Trevor, and thank you so much for being with us today. It's wow, already a very special feeling hearing you talk with Mina and Diana and others this morning. Trevor Avery is the Holocaust historian and director of the Lake District Holocaust Project in Windermere in the United Kingdom. Now, I'd heard Mark say that Windermere is in the north of England, but I still couldn't picture that at all. So I looked it up on Google Maps and I saw this very, an interesting geographic area with sort of fingers of lakes sticking around, sort of like pinwheeling out from a central area. And Windermere looks like a very large lake, actually. And just sort of west over the water from Northern Ireland. Trevor is engaged in an ongoing project looking at the connections and legacy of the 300 child survivors of the Holocaust who came to Windermere in the Lake District of England in 1945, directly after their liberation from concentration camps of Nazi-occupied Europe. And I hope that some of you had the opportunity to see one or both of the films that Mark made accessible, the docudrama, and then the documentary with interviews from those survivors. And thank you everybody for being with us from near and far. I think that we have near and we have far. We know that Trevor is out there in the Lake District, and some of us are here in Waltham, Massachusetts, and in nearby towns, Newton and Lexington. Mark, do you want me to hand it off to you now?
Sure. So I will invite, as all of you are figuring out who's here, if you would like to say hello in the chat and let us know where you're from. And if there's someone you'd like to remember today, please do. You can mention their names in chat. I also want to acknowledge a few people who are on the call. My mom, my Aunt Mina, whose husband, my Uncle Leo, is also one of the Windermere Children. Judy Roth, whose dad is also on the call.
That's my dad. Dad. Say hi. Dad is one of the Windermere Children.
Who is one of the Windermere Children. And Robin Friedman Shaw, who's joining us from Florida, whose dad was also one of the Windermere Children. So I want to especially acknowledge you guys and welcome you to be with us today. When I was a child, my father rarely spoke about his experiences during the Holocaust. He would tell us about his parents and his siblings in the village in Poland where he grew up, as it was before the war. And growing up, there was no Holocaust Memorial Day because every day was Holocaust Memorial Day. With reminders around the house, the portrait of my father's sister killed during the war that hangs up in the dining room, and that box labeled Bernie's old photos that stayed closed. We would visit his friends in Montreal or New York, other survivors with whom he was liberated and with whom they stayed in touch throughout their lives. They were the boys who he knew from Windermere. Shimon and Joe were at his wedding. Sam Pivnik from London was the first to send us a Rosh Hashanah card every year. He mentioned Sam Laskier and Ben Helfgott and Krulik and Jacob Meltzer and Moshe Nerlman and so many others of his lifelong friends. They were family to each other because they had no other family. They were liberated from Theresienstadt in 1945 and flown to Windermere. They were in the Lake District of Northern England. For many of them, it was paradise. My father told the story that it was in Windermere where he had his first meal on a plate. We all know what happened during the Holocaust, and the Windermere Children tells the story of what happened after. How a group of orphans would rebuild their lives and maintain those friendships for now 76 years. In recent years, I got to meet many of my dad's childhood friends and their children. And 2 years ago, many of us met in Prague to retake a photo that was taken in England just before they left for Windermere. And I will show you that photo in a second. Let's see. Let's try that. So there we go. So here we all are in Prague. I know Judy stood over on the right-hand side someplace. I'm on the left, and I don't remember where Robin stood. And this was taken in Prague just before they left at the top. And when a bunch of us, their children and grandchildren, and several of the original survivors were in the front row 2 years ago for this reunion of survivors. I first met Trevor and his assistant Rose in Manchester, England, in 2018. And Trevor knows the stories of the boys and the girls of Windermere probably better than anyone else. For the past 15 years, he's been collecting their stories and their photos and their artifacts for the Lake District Holocaust Project in Windermere, where he curates the exhibit from Auschwitz to Ambleside that tells the story of child survivors who came to the Lake District in 1945 and the community that welcomed them. Trevor was also the primary research advisor for the film, The Windermere Children. So we welcome Trevor Avery this morning. Or this afternoon for you.
Oh, there we go. Thank you, Mark. Thank you, everybody, for inviting me. It's always a pleasure, but it's always, I do get a little bit emotional at times, I have to say, especially when I know when second generation join us, and then we've got some of the boys themselves and the girls. It does, it makes us all realize this is an ancient history. You know, I think when I first began doing this, there was certainly a tendency for people to think this is heritage, it's in the past, you know, and the more I've done this and the more I've been involved, the more I realize it's a sort of a history, but it has enormous lessons for us all living in the contemporary world and for the future. I'll talk a little bit about that later. So where do I begin? Where do I fit in? Well, I think, as a rabbi mentioned, Windermere in the Lake District it's even now in a pretty remote part of England. It's on the borders between England and Scotland. It is an iconic location, and it's one of these things they call a cultural identifier for England and Britain. 300 years ago, the Romantic movement, Wordsworth, Keats, Shelley, Coleridge, they basically invented the Lake District. They invented Romanticism. It's mountains, it's lakes. At that time, people were beginning to have to leave the countryside, the rural side, and go and live in cities. And Wordsworth led this movement to sort of idealize, in a sense, what people were leaving behind, this pastoral idyll. One of the fascinating things people have asked me, why does this story, of all the survivors and who came to the UK and went to the States, well, why did this one become elevated from a Holocaust story to become a Warner Brothers back drama? What was it about it? And it's very much, I've thought about it a lot. And one, the key, I think, is the Lake District. So Professor Tony Kushner at Southampton University studies Anglo-Jewish relations historically. And he put it perfectly when he said it was the coming together of two epics. It's the epic grandeur and splendor and wonder of the Lake District and Romanticism coming together with the epic tragedy of the Holocaust. And you couldn't bring together two more opposing sort of vistas, if you like. and certainly with Romanticism, when I tell you that the Lake District only has within the 40,000 people living in it, but it receives over 20 million visitors per year. That's the cultural magnet that it is. They come from all over the world, but throughout England, everywhere. That it's a magnet every summer for visitors to come and regenerate themselves. Mountaineering, swimming, boating, it's all there. So it was a perfect location to bring 300 children and young survivors who had been liberated from the camps, had been not only experienced horrific things, but actually witnessed horrific things. To bring them to the Lake District was a good call. But I'll talk a little bit later about why a lot of happenstance. It wasn't sort of preordained to come to Lake District. So where do I fit in? Well, I'd lived in London. I worked in the museum service and exhibitions for 30, 40 years. And I had lived in London, I'd lived in Scotland, and I came to work in the Lake District, in the arts, exhibitions. And I curated an exhibition in 2005. Even I have to stop and pause how long ago it was. And it was ostensibly, the exhibition was in an abbreviated form. It was simply to tell the story of an aircraft factory, a seaplane factory that was placed on the shores of Lake Windermere, which, as the Rabbi did notice, that it's the biggest lake in England. So, but it's a very, very protected area. Even then, it was defended by the Friends of the Lake District against modern things coming in. It was sort of preserved as a monument to Romanticism. But there was a tremendous battle, and because it was wartime, it was necessary. The largest single-span building in Britain, possibly Europe, was built in very short order on the shores of Windermere. It was a huge intervention into this Lake District, and it was an industrial factory process to build aircraft. Again, the biggest aircraft of its time in the world, these seaplanes. But to house the workers, it was a very rural area. Most of the people here did dry stone walling, they did farming, they did build boats. There was a sort of a tourism industry then, nothing like the scale of it now, where people would visit, go boating on the lakes. So most of the people who lived there were skilled like that. And one of them said to me, this aircraft factory arriving was like Apollo landing. You know, it was just so extraordinary. And they had to build a housing scheme nearby at a quaintly named place called Trap Bridge, which gives an indication of the type of village we're looking at. It became known over time as Calgarth Estates, and it was purely built, functioning housing scheme to house the workers. They came from the industrial cities. The engineers came to build, with their families, to build these aircraft factories. If we then wheel forward to 2005, I put this exhibition on in this market town near Windermere about this factory and these workers. And one of the workers said to me, and if anybody doubts that your life can turn on a moment, completely spin around, there was a comment from an old gentleman who told me about his life on the estate and the work he did. And he said, and of course, you know, this is where the children from Auschwitz came. And of course, I didn't know. I was absolutely, come again. He said, oh, yeah. I remember he said, and he very casually said, oh, yes. He said, when they arrived, he said they didn't have any, they were full of life, full of energy. And he said, they never knocked on your door. He said, we all lived in our own houses and hostels. And he said, suddenly the door would just burst open and this gang of teenagers would run in. And he said, if they couldn't speak, they're full of life, full of life. So he said, my mother would sit them down for a cup of tea and a piece of cake, and they'd chat away. And then as quickly as that, they would leave the house and the door open and run out again. And he said they were just so full of life. And I thought, what was this whirlwind that arrived, here? So I asked some local people, nobody really knew anything. And I to cut a long story short, I contacted the Jewish Museum in London, and they said, you need to talk to somebody called Ben Helfgott, Sir Ben Helfgott, as we know now, because he said, we're pretty sure he was in Windermere and he was one of these children. So I contacted Ben, he's opening, and I said, is that Ben Helfgott? You know, he said, yes. He said, it's Trevor I'm calling from Windermere. I'm investigating the story. I believe you were in Windermere with a lot of other youngsters. And he said, and his first words were, oh, Windermere. And I thought, I'm pushing at an open door. So we began chatting, and London was a fair, it's not a huge distance, but it's a bit of a trek from Windermere to London initially. So he said, I'll arrange for you to meet one of the boys in Manchester. One of the boys that came to Windermere. So in a very short time afterwards, I was standing in the Midland Hotel foyer in Manchester, a very grand hotel where Mr. Royce met to start the Rolls-Royce business. It's a historic hotel with a couple of colleagues, and suddenly through the door, not one survivor came through the door, but three. The door spun around, and these three elderly gentlemen came in, and I've only ever described it. They walked in as though it was three versions of Fred Astaire. They kind of sauntered in, and my immediate thought was, this isn't how Holocaust survivors are supposed to be. I was I had interviewed survivors before in previous life, but they sauntered in, and then they sat down, and we started drinking cups of tea, and we had a photographer there to document it. Now, recently I checked back, I thought the meeting was for 2 hours, but actual fact, I checked through my records, and it was nearly 6 hours, but the time just flew by. I don't know where it went. I can believe, because I had to dash, of course, to get a train back to Windermere. And the first 4.5 hours or so, it was just a flow of jokes and laughter and jokes. And I laughed along with them. And one of my colleagues, Susan, she was from the Jewish community. We have a very, very small Jewish community in Bowness in Windermere. And she said, oh God, she said, it's just so many jokes. When are they going to stop telling jokes? And I said, just let it roll. So we just let it roll. And then the final half an hour, I was aware that I had to catch a train back to Manchester. And I said, look, guys, I said, this is great. Can I tell your story of your time in Windermere? Can I tell you how you came to be there and your stories? And at that moment, the three guys were Maya, Jack, and Sam. And two of them had been in Auschwitz. One had been in Warsaw Ghetto, and one had been in Buchenwald. And I mean, the stories were just, you know, they're all the names that we know and sort of make us a bit repulsive. But and immediately Jack, who was a very, very successful businessman and the really excellent raconteur, very wise, he immediately began to cry. It was such a sudden shift in mood. And I noticed that Sam, next to him, slowly moved over his hand and put his hand on Jack's wrist as comfort. Now, these were all quite formidable businessmen in one sense, but there's a vulnerability there. And I thought, there's a connection between them here. And they said, of course, we will help you all that we can. And I remember Maya, who was in Auschwitz for 18 months and survived in Birkenau, which is it's an incredible story in itself. He had a little photograph album with him, and he opened the photograph album, and it was a full book of pages, but only 3 pages had photographs in them. And they were the only photographs that he had of his mother and his father, who were very, very young in the photographs, and his sister. And he said, one day I'm going to find, we had a magnificent photograph album, family album. One day I'm going to find that album, and I'm going to put them all in here. And I can't tell you how many trips I've made to Shiraz, where he was born. And each time, until he passed away recently, I certainly would ask them, has anybody come across a photograph album? And he would always ask me, did you find my photograph album? I said, I'm afraid not, Maya, but things keep turning up now. You know, he was driven in that sense. So that was the start of the journey with the boys. and the girls, I have to say. And at that point, I want a quick clarification. Recently, it's become something contentious that they're known as the boys. But it wasn't any attempt, believe you me, to write out the girls of the story. It was Ben Helfgott told me it was a name that was given to them. These are my boys, one of the carers. So that was given to them. But, and I asked Minia J, who is a fantastic lady. She was formidable in her own right, very, very close friend of mine. And she was in Windermere. And I said to Minia, how does it make you feel to be, and she was very grand, very diva-ish, and very, very, very out there. And she said, it is an honor to be a boy. And it was just a wonderful way of just, yep, I get that. So, so then I set about with my friends and my colleagues, with Ben's help, with Cockle's help, with all sorts of boys and girls' help. We knew at that time, most of them were in their mid-70s. So we knew then it's a bit of a race against time, but there was still well over 100 still with us to interview them and get their stories from Windermere and their life stories. But Sir Ben told me in a very, very early meeting, because I'd said to him, we'd like to establish some kind of memorial to you guys in Windermere, the Lake District, a memorial project. He said, no, Trevor, no. He said, no memorials. We learned to live again in Windermere. We didn't die in Windermere. We lived again. So you've got to do something much more positive. So we kind of turned it into a commemoration, a positive commemoration rather than, but we do acknowledge absolutely the losses that they had, that they'd left behind. So we began to interview them, and then we also began to discover many of the local people who used to live on Calgarth but moved into Windermere village itself, who remembered them being here. And it's fair to say I didn't discover the story. The story was known within the boys group itself, the 45A Society. They'd kept it alive and they'd met every year. And it was kept alive in the form of workers who lived on the estate. I had to tease it out of both of them, or the teasing it out of the boys wasn't difficult, I have to say. Just get them to talk about it and then bring the two of them together, which is where From Auschwitz to Ambleside came from. We spent 5 years interviewing them, interviewing the locals, but we also began to occur to me, we began to visit Poland, and we began to visit some of the Theresienstadt, Auschwitz. We began to visit some of the places where some of the boys and girls were born and grew up, and some of the places where they lost their families, where they were murdered. Because we just felt that we were getting, many of them couldn't visit Poland again. They wouldn't go back. They were curious, but they wouldn't go back. So we felt as though we had to go back and see where the beginning really was. Because I often give talks, for many years I give talks to schools and to adult audiences. And I often say to people, they want to hear the good news story. They want to hear about the children arriving in Windermere and it's paradise, what a wonderful time they had and recovered. But I think you to really grasp, none of us can, because we haven't thankfully lived through what they lived through, but we can't really grasp what it meant to them to arrive in Windermere without knowing a little about what they'd lived through before. I think as Jack Eisenberg said, the leap in circumstance from Theresienstadt to Windermere was just, they couldn't believe it. I was on a talk recently with Ike Alterman, and Ike even now becomes effervescent about the change. It was things like food. He said he remembered even landing at Carlisle Airport, Crosby Eden Airport, being taken into the aircraft hangar nearby and seeing piles of white bread with jam in, and seeing tea and seeing milk there, and seeing, he said, it was just extraordinary. And then we went we were taken on buses to Calgarth Estate, and there was more food and more bread. And as it came along the table, we'd take it off the table and hide it. And they'd say to us, you don't need to do that, come with us. And they would take us into the bakery and the pantry at the back and say, look, there's plenty of bread. You don't need to steal it or hide it or whatever. Many of them still did. They couldn't believe that this was permanent after what they'd lived through, this change in fortune. So they'd arrived on the 14th of August 1945. They arrived late afternoon and into the evening. Many of them arrived after darkness. It was a fair journey from Carlisle to Windermere at that time. So many of them, as depicted in the film, they arrived in darkness. They were taken to these, they called them chalets, but officially they were known as hostels. And in the morning, when they woke up in daylight, they suddenly saw where they were: mountains, birds, trees, and the whole thing. And they just, Ben said he was just effervescent. They couldn't believe where they'd arrived. But they weren't, it wasn't without challenges, because as one of them famously says, where some of the worst atrocities of the Holocaust happened, this particular boy had been in Majdanek for a while and left, and he said, it looked like there. You know, we saw the houses around, and we saw this remote area, and having been to places like Chelmno and Treblinka, they were in rural areas. So there was a sort of a, some of the boys thought, have they brought us somewhere? Have we come somewhere? It didn't help that although the factory had stopped producing aircraft, there were still workers there with blue overalls and dirty, coming back home again. And they saw those coming out, thought, oh my God, it's slave labourers. We're going to be slave labourers again. You know, there was a lot of anxiety about it. Hadn't fully transitioned, if I put it like that. But as Marie Paneth, we have a eyewitness account in her book of that very first meeting. The locals were on the estate. They'd saw, some of them have been told, we've got 300 young survivors coming from the concentration camps. There was a big team of carers who'd been arrived to prepare the way for them to come. The carers, led by Oscar Friedman, Lena Montefiore, they didn't know what they were taking on. And they shared it with some of the locals, saying, we don't know what these children are going to be like. Bear with us. So the locals came. So the carers were as anxious about what these children were going to be like, in the same way the locals were. And Marie Paneth writes in her book that we need not have worried that the children burst out of their hostels at around noontime, and immediately ran into the estate, and immediately conversations were struck up with locals. Locals who were curious about who they were. The boys were curious about who they were. There was a sort of a sign language to it because they couldn't speak English. The locals, having had a few bicycles disappear, the boys went heading off on the bicycles to explore where they were. The locals got sort of a bit fed up with their bicycles disappearing. So a large van turned up, the doors were opened, and they said, stop taking our bikes, have one. So they gave the boys some bikes to have. They set up a radio, a sort of a bit of a radio station was set up at Calgarth by the locals, by the engineers, so that the boys could listen to radio from Poland, from their home, so they could listen to connect. There was one, we got many stories where one local child who was very small, she won a prize at a fete. A tombola, we call it. I don't know if you get a tombola, but she won this little bracelet. Then she walked over and gave the bracelet to one of the smaller young Jewish children. And the head teacher who was with this child said, why did you do that? And she said, because I've got everything, she's got nothing. So you have a real sense of, and this is when the boys talk about it was wonderful in Windermere, it was like paradise. They would quickly clarify that, or they would expound on that by saying, yes, it was the lake, it was the mountains, but it was also the welcome we got from the carers, from the people. And you're talking about, I mean, you know the stories as well as I do, that the word dignity comes from them very often when they talk about, we were treated with dignity for the first time in years, common courtesy. What is to most of us, you and I, a fairly regular occurrence of a good morning, hello, how are you? To these youngsters, they weren't used to that. And to have somebody for instance, digging their garden in the front of a house in the Lake District, raising his hat and saying to them, "Good morning, what a lovely day," and putting his hat back on. These children couldn't believe this kind of, they weren't used to this. And it was interesting because when they first arrived, it was noted that the boys generally, or large groups of them, walked in step, because that's what they've been drilled to do in the camps. So there was often, and one of the first signs of recovery was when they began to notice them not walking in step, that the rules began to relax. And there was rebelliousness. I mean, the boys will say themselves, and the girls, that they'd say with a grin that we were a handful. We needed to be re-civilized. And it's fair to say we have many stories. One reason they did consider taking them to London, taking them to Manchester, taking them to Liverpool. One reason why the Lake District was because, yes, it was beautiful and it was a beautiful place to do it, but also it was easier to keep an eye on them. There was concern. Many of these youngsters had learned to live on their wits. They'd learned to, you can imagine being a youngster in these camps and surviving. Some of them lived on their wits. I mean, one of them said, we were all like the Artful Dodger. We trade, this. So that sort of habit carried on in Windermere. But in Windermere, what was interesting, the Leonard Montefiore and the guys put the word out to the locals. If any of the guys, these youngsters, take anything, don't challenge them. Just tell us, and we'll give the money instead. So I had a wonderful moment where the boys would love to tell the story about how, I think I told it recently, about one of them would go to pay to go into the cinema in Windermere, and he would go in the front having paid. He would then make his way to the rear exit, open the door to let all the other boys in without paying, and they'd line up in the cinema. And he thought it was absolutely hilarious, because I said to him, but you do realise that the usher of the cinema knew what you were doing, it counted you all in, and then asked Leonard Montefiore to cover your tickets. And he thought that was absolutely hilarious, because he said, well, I've thought for 65 years, I thought I got away with it. And now you're telling me, so he thought it was all part of this. It paints a lovely picture. So we'd amassed all this material. We did a documentary for BBC One in 2010. And we thought that was pretty of a pinnacle for the story. And then in 2017, by then we were involved with Downing Street, with the Prime Minister's Holocaust Commission, about what do we do about commemorating the Holocaust when the survivors have gone. So I'd made a couple of visits to Downing Street, and it was involved with the Holocaust Commission, which was based there. And the head of the commission then was a chap called Sir Peter Bazalgette, who is a major figure in the media in this country. And he was also head of the Holocaust Commission. And also at the same time, the BBC and Warner Brothers were looking to commission a documentary for 2020, for the 70th anniversary of the end of the Holocaust. But so in 2017, they were looking to these two areas. We're looking to how can we support you? This is an amazing story, and what program? And it came together like that. Wall to Wall said, we'd like to come up to Windermere. We're thinking of doing a documentary about the Windermere children, the boys and girls. What have you got? So we invited them up, and because the Lake District hasn't changed very much at all. It's one of the joys whenever the boys have come back and the girls, you can walk in their footsteps. You can take the same footpath to the lakeside where they stripped off and swam. You can go to the children's hospital and you can still see the balcony where they stayed. We even have photographs of them around the Lake District where they sat and were photographed. We can sit people there and photographed again. So we walked these areas with the researchers for the documentary, and that shifted their opinion. It became, oh, we'll do a 90-minute drama instead. So they sent a scriptwriter up, and it was Simon Block, and Simon was a terrific guy. He he wrote the Eichmann trials. He was involved in his big history in that sense. And we walked these areas with him. We showed him all the material, the interviews we had and the photographs and the archives, but we also walked the Lake District for 2 days with him. And I just told him story after anecdotes and anecdotes. And that became, he wrote a script, and it had, every incident that you see in the Windermere Children is based on something that really happened. It's been dramatized slightly, but they all happened because we were all sat down in a room by Sir Peter Bazalgette at Downing Street, and he said, we have to, although this is a drama, it has to be based in reality, because in 100 years' time, we've got to be wary of Holocaust deniers. So everything you see is based on something that happened. Sometimes it's slightly changed for dramatic purposes, and it didn't necessarily happen to the 5 main characters, but the things all happened to some of the boys and girls that were here. So having made the film drama, and I'm cutting it very short, they then decided at the nth hour, it was to be released in January 2020. They decided in November that the whole thing was in the can, so to speak. Warner Brothers in Germany, which was interesting, said, we want a documentary as well. So all hands to the pump. Trevor, we got 3 weeks to make a documentary about the Windermere Children. So we ended up with a double whammy of an hour-and-a-half drama and a 35-minute documentary as well, because we had so much material, so much information. Because we were talking about 300, in its essence, young Holocaust survivors. And believe you me, you could spend, I've done this 16 years now, you could spend 16 years researching one Holocaust survivor, but when you have 300, it's a massive job, but they are very, very, very representative of the Holocaust. If you name one of the sites linked to the Holocaust, I mentioned earlier, Auschwitz, Buchenwald, Chelmno, Treblinka, Warsaw Ghetto, Łódź Ghetto, I mean, it goes on and on. You will find a connection among these children to one of these sites. So we can educate young people about the Holocaust, which we do, through these children. And the added bonus that we've been very lucky to have is having for many years, one of the children, sometimes 2 or 3 would fetch up in person, talking at the Lake School, which stands on the site where they stayed at Calgarth, which really did bring it alive for young people, who for many of them, the Holocaust is a long time ago. And we don't have any significant Jewish community up here. We do have a Jewish community, but it's of no significance. So we were talking to children in terms of Holocaust education in this area, who many of them hadn't even met a Jewish person. You know, they didn't have any knowledge of this. So we would bring the boys up, and the boys would laugh and joke and tell the story. So for us, in an area which Holocaust education is as important here as it is anywhere else, we've made that an absolute feature. It can help children in issues that they face in their daily lives, lessons from the boys' story. And the boys have been inspirational. I give just one instance. Arik Hirsch came to give a talk. He's been coming to the Lake School for many years. Arik came with his wife, Jean, and Arik gave his talk to the Lake School. And when we came to sit down to have the lunch afterwards, and the children had left, one of the children had hung back to try and talk to Arik, but in the crowd, he couldn't get to him. And then in the end, so the lunch bell went, and they all went off to have their lunch. And as we sat down, I sat next to Arik, and I said, one of the teachers just told me, did you notice a very quiet boy that was at the back of the group? And he said, as a matter of fact, I did. And I said, well, he wanted to talk to you. One of the teachers told me, he wanted to talk to you. He recently lost his father. His father died in a climbing accident, fell off a mountain about 6 weeks ago. And he wanted to talk to you. Without a word or any expression, in a room full of dignitaries waiting to talk to him, Arik simply stood up and he said, where will he be? I said, well, I would think he would be in the lunch room, having his lunch. Arik just stood up, left the room, and disappeared off. With all the dignitaries standing around, went to talk for this lunch. And then 20, 25 minutes later, he came back in the room, sat himself down next to me again, and started to just eat. And I said, did you find him? He said, oh yeah, we talked. And that was all that was said. But I tell you, in hindsight, they had a long conversation about he knew what it felt like to lose his family in completely different circumstances. But the mark of the man was, without even a second thought, I'll go find him. And he went. And so that leaves a tremendous feeling of warmth in its wake. And they've done that many, many times. When they come and they talk, and it brings the story to life to young people now, who frankly have no real connection to it. These happened for some of them, 70, 60 years before they were born. But it brings it alive, and we were very lucky to have this site, the actual site where it happened, where we do archaeology and with a focus on there. So in the Windermere Children, the drama and the documentary have taken us onto a different level, in the sense that I felt I spent an awful lot of time persuading many people that yes, this actually happened. I remember the BBC when they wanted to make a documentary. We've heard about these 300 children that came to the Lake District in Windermere. Did it really happen? I said, yes, it did. Can you prove it? I always have to send them information and proof of what happened, because it was such an incredible story that was largely hidden. I think the boys and girls talked about it amongst themselves. The locals did, but it had never been sort of brought out into the open. And I was just the one, I was just sort of, people have asked me, why did I do it? And I could go into a long explanation why, but essentially, it had to be done. Nobody had done it. It needed to be done. And I even now, I'm waiting for someone to tap me on the shoulder and say, you don't have to do this. It's already been done. Now, Sir Martin Gilbert certainly touched on it in his wonderful book, The Boys. That's the one I always start with, written in the late 90s. But his section on Windermere is relatively short because it's a vast tome. He covers the stories of all 732 children that came. The Windermere guys were the first 300. So he had this enormous story of all three of 732. And within that, he's drilling down into individuals and personalities. And Windermere is a small section. And I thought, and Sir Martin wasn't so very well when I began this work, but I did manage to swap some messages and emails with him. And I said, if I can do a fraction of what you've done in Holocaust, biographer of Churchill, I mean, it's incalculable his contributions to Holocaust research and archives and everything. And he said, just do what you can, you're doing a great job. And I think because I found myself living here and discovering this story, you can discover things which, just by being on the ground, chatting. As before this started, we chatted, and this is how a lot of this research is from. Somebody will say something which would lead you to somewhere else. You discover a lot of the material we have. There are documents and papers that we knew were always there. We got some, but our biggest concern, one, I used to enjoy, and I still do, very much spending time with the boys and the girls and their families. I became very close to them, and I wanted to get their stories from them. And a lot of the stories that we have, you won't find them in any books. And often the stories will appear. You will give an interview to somebody and they will interview them. And then we have one famous incident, which I didn't do, but my colleague Roz, one of the boys was told his story. And then he said, so have we stopped now? And she said, yeah, we have. But she carried on recording. He said, I'll tell you the truth now. Which was a sort of a different take on the struggles he'd had and this, although said they would do this. So, and I found myself over time taking on a lot of the stories. And I think somebody said it recently, Philip, has become another new friend of mine, Philip Goldberg in the States. And Philip was curious about what I did. I used Father Moniac as one of the boys. And he said, I think you were possibly the first outsider to take an interest in their stories. Because I don't know why they embraced, I don't know why. It was just, they just told their stories. And I know we chatted again before this began. For some of these, many of them, far more than I first realized, couldn't talk about it and didn't want to. And I found myself increasingly over time trying to answer questions from, they've passed away, from their children ask me, because their fathers and mothers didn't tell them anything. So Windermere, for many of the guys, has been a starting point. It is for many people. Windermere is you can enter the Holocaust, which is a tough area for a lot of people. It has, you know, we all know the dark aspects, but you can enter it through Windermere, and then many people come to Windermere first and then work backwards into the Holocaust. It's a starting point. It's a kind of, I'm not saying it's approachable, but it is. Sometimes it's better to start with the good news and go backwards, because the thought of the bad is just too bad to comprehend. So, and I was helping a lot of second generation begin, setting them on their path as to where to go. And that has gone on to another level since the drama and the documentary appeared. We've appeared in Who Do You Think You Are? Won a BAFTA with Rob Rinder. We've helped in so many ways. But there has been a sea change recently when a major newspaper got in touch and said, we want to cover something about Windermere, about your story. I said, okay then. Well, 300 children arrived. And I'm like, no, everybody knows that now. We need another angle. Now that was a breakthrough for me, because I'd spent the past 16 years trying to get the story known. And people were stumbling across the exhibition in Windermere. We didn't know this, we didn't know this, we didn't know this. So getting it onto such an international platform in such a way has done an amazing job for us. I mean, I now sit on Zoom calls with major Holocaust institutions of the world, in the States and everywhere. And I don't need to introduce Windermere. Now, when I tell you Windermere is a small village in the north of England, which is really quite remote, to have that with such a profile that you're talking to Washington and San Francisco and London and Yad Vashem, and it's little Windermere, is quite humbling for me. But it's also, it's the significance of the story. I go back to what Sir Ben said. This isn't a memorial. We don't want a memorial there. We started life again there. And I think it's that essence of hope that it has. There's a dark aspect to it, but it's that hope, and it's the hope that I think is encapsulated at the end of the drama. When, I won't say, I don't want to do a spoiler, but that transition from then to the present day is immensely moving, because what it symbolizes is triumph over adversity. That even in that darkest time, they estimate that 1.5 million children were murdered in the Holocaust. They estimate, and we had 300 came to Windermere, and 300 is a tiny number, but they did survive, and they have, as Mark showed earlier. I was at the gathering in Prague with some of the survivors, with Ben and Sam and Arik, and then the children, and then some of the grandchildren, and then great grandchildren. It's the beginning of something. Windermere is the beginning of more than just the boys and the girls beginning their lives again, but it's almost like the reconstruction of all their families again. They'll go down the ages, and I'm just very proud to have played a small part in it. I have to say, we haven't stopped now. I've heard some more connections coming through, more material that we've discovered. It's coming through all the time, but I feel we've come to the end of something with the Windermere Children, but we're at the beginning of something else now. I've now got something developing, the US Library of Congress, with the museum in Vienna, with Yad Vashem. I mean, it's quite astonishing now. It's a matter of huge sadness to me that there are so few of them left. You know, and it's actually, I think we're all aware of it, but until last year, I sort of pushed it to the back of my mind. But I said, oh, we're down to really only one or two can go on television and do, you know, because those, some of them are not very well at all. But we're kind of, thank goodness we did what we did. Myself and old Rosemary and Chris and a lot of people have been involved. We did what we did when we did, because we couldn't have done it now. You know, we couldn't, and a lot of the little stories in the Windermere Children wouldn't be, you wouldn't be able to capture that from a document or a file. It had to come from, you know, from human personal stories. And but I wasn't aware of that when I was doing it. We just thought it has to be done as quickly as possible. So I hope that helps. I'm happy to take questions if that's helped everybody. I could talk. I've been known to give a talk at Ravenston Community Centre, not far from me. They kept me talking for over 3.5 hours with questions. You know, it's as broad as it's long. It's an enormous. You're covering 300 stories, you know, of children who survived the Holocaust, their families and the circumstances. But I hope this has given you an insight into some of the background.
Trevor, thank you. I don't think we'll go for 3.5 hours, but if anyone does have a question, feel free to raise your hand and I'll acknowledge you. There was one question that came in the chat while people raise their hands. Were the actors in the drama British or Polish, German? I noticed that they spoke Polish and German.
Wall to Wall, the production company, put an advertisement out for young actors, and they came from Poland and Germany. For I think most of them, all of them, it was their debut performance, and I think it was a deliberate decision to try and capture the innocence and some rawness about that would have been like the boys and girls were when they came. They had an incredible moment of seeing when I was invited to the final shot on location, and I was there when young Ben, the actor, met old Ben, our survivor, and young Arik and old Arik. I was there to see them mingling, and it was absolutely glorious thing to see. It was almost like time travel. See these old, you know, respected gentlemen sort of swapping stories and laughing and joking with these youngsters who perform them. But I'd met the young actors before the survivors turned up, and I can't tell you how nerve-wracking it was for them. They were shaking like a leaf. So, the one who played Ben, the film won the Pre-Europa award last year in Berlin for the best television drama of 2020. It's a major award, and it was said that the young actors were brilliant. But I tell you, young Ben was absolutely shaking like a leaf because he was meeting, and he wasn't a shy boy, but he was shaking at the thought of meeting Ben. And then Ben came through the doorway and immediately put them all at ease. It was wonderful to see where he was.
Diana, you're muted.
I'm curious about two things. Who paid for and got the idea to bring the boys to Windermere? The other question, let me just say both.
Oh, yeah.
The other was, is it known if the children expressed any interest and wanting for Jewish ritual?
Good questions. The first one is that it was the Central British Fund, now known as World Jewish Relief. They persuaded the British government to accept 1,000 children, survivors of the camps, led primarily by Leonard Montefiore. But the British government said, you can bring 1,000, but we will not contribute anything to this. It's all got to come through charitable funding. Britain at the time wasn't accepting anybody into the country post-war. and the Central British Fund took it upon themselves to raise the funding. They faced enormous challenges. It was a much more, it cost a lot more than they originally realised. Everything had to be paid for. So although the boys were very grateful, and they are now, for Britain taking these children in, there's been some conjecture as to why the final number was only 732 and not 1,000. We have some indication it's because Leonard Montefiore was beginning to worry they couldn't raise enough money. Because it wasn't just bringing them to Windermere. They then packaged them out in parcels to hostels. I think Rosie Whitehouse and 45 Ed have done a lot of work on the next stage after what happened in the hostels. They're rebuilding their lives after that. The hostels had to be paid for. Then they were set up in jobs and work. The support went on for 5, 6, 7 years. You know, they carried on supporting them. Not only, I've had this discussion with some British members of Parliament, politicians, that when asylum seekers or refugees come to this country, there's a big push on to do that. They often use the boys' story as, we welcome these boys and we did this. I said, no, the British government didn't pay for this. And if you bring what the lessons I've learned from the survivors is they had a tremendous will to get on and get on with life. Marie Peneth says at one point, we arrived in Windermere, we quickly realised these children did not want pity, they wanted help to get on with life.
Yeah.
They did a leg up. So, and I said to the guys, if you bring people into the country, you've got to provide the ongoing support, because the boys will say that they needed a leg up. And if you give them a leg up, my goodness, what a contribution they've made. We've had chief rabbis, we've had attorney generals, we've had economics, we've had historians, all sorts coming up from this group. And and they are ever so grateful to this country for letting them in, and they're giving a lot back. The Jewish rituals is a really lovely story of, and this is where it comes together with two stories. They weren't sure. I think the feeling was they didn't know what type of backgrounds these children were coming from. So they provided rabbis and they provided support, spiritual support, in case they wanted to take advantage of whatever was on offer. Now, the local, there's a Mrs. Llewellyn famously, she was a cook, she was a local lady, a cook. And she said, it was great for us, because when the Jewish children came, it hadn't been rapid, there'd been a shortage of fish during the war. We got lots of fish, and we cooked lots of fish. And she said, and then they would go and have a ritual, as she described it, because she didn't know what Jewish, she said, up on the hill in Calgarth, they'd have run off. We had to go and clear up after them. But she said there'd clearly been a Jewish commemoration going on. We think it was possibly Hanukkah, we're not sure, but something had gone on at that time. And we know that there was a bit of, when you have 300 children like that and survivors, you have a complete range of backgrounds within the Jewish community. Mm-hmm. Some that came, it's fair to say, were and remain totally religious, very, like chief rabbi came. But also at the other extreme, some came and they were complete atheists. After what I've seen in the camps, there is no God. And you have every range in between. But you did have Rabbi Weiss was here, Rabbi Cohen. We know the yeshiva, the largest school, learning school for Jewish communities in Gateshead, Newcastle, the north of England. We know a lot of the guys came from the yeshiva, Rabbi Weiss being one, to provide spiritual support and religious background. Ike Altimer will tell the story. He won't mind me telling you that he was kind of quite taken aback by one of the religious leaders who came and said to him at Windermere, how did you manage to keep up your studies in the concentration camps? And Ike said, do you know where we've been? Do you know where we've been? Ike will give you the story with both barrels. Have you any idea? But I think that was part of this mismatch between here and there. You know, that people. So yeah, there was, we know that when they left, we know that they painted the walls of one of the smaller hostels, images of Palestine as they visualized it.
Oh, wow.
Images of Palestine. And we know one of the blocks was very, very Zionist that wanted to get off to Palestine immediately. And we know that was where they sort of had a synagogue, a shul. It was there if they wanted it. And I say that there's a range across those who did. I think they were a fairly mixed bunch. The Bund had a lot of the children that came here had a Bundist background. Some were quite orthodox, some were proper, some were not at all. It's a mishmash. Some of them were complete characters, I have to put it like that, and they remained complete charmers, certainly all the time. And you could see they will all say, they'll all have different reasons, different incidents. So I don't know how I said it, but they'll all say luck was the major part of how they survived. But one of them, Jack, who is very, very wise, Jack said to me, somebody asked him, do you believe in God? And he said, well, when I was in the camps, I prayed every day and I'm still here. And that, that sort of, okay, he leaves it open. And that's how I think for many of them, it felt like that. I'm slightly bewildered as to how they survived. But they all have, you sort of get a sense, luck was involved, but all of them seem to have had something about them, a quality. One of them, the main one being not giving in.
Yeah.
There was a tremendous temptation under those. And I've heard many stories of how they witnessed people arriving and giving in immediately.
Thank you. Let's take one more. Ed, did you have a question?
Yes, I do. Trevor, I can't thank you enough for coming to us today.
Oh, it's a pleasure.
Just a question. What was the range of age of the children?
Well, there was supposed to be a strict range from 8 years old until 15, 16. But actually, we now know that the oldest may well have been as old as 22, 23. Yeah. The youngest was possibly 3 years old. Well, we know they were 3 years old. When the list went through to the chap in London, the list of the names, in the Home Office, he went absolutely, what are you doing? They're not the age they're supposed to be. The British government's attitude was they had to be of an age so they could stand on their own feet. We're not going to support these. Anybody who can't stand up, we're not. But actually, we also know in Windermere now that roughly a fifth of the 300 were ill enough to need medical attention. And roughly 12 to 14 were so seriously ill, they had to be put into hospital here. We had plenty of, being the countryside, we had plenty of tuberculosis hospitals. But the stipulation from the government had been, everybody must have been in quarantine and everybody must be in AA top condition before they come. So there were lots of rules being broken. Many of the guys that came to Windermere, some of the older ones, it's fair to say they tried to return home and hadn't had much success. So they'd gone back to Poland. They'd faced opposition in Poland from where they'd come from. They went back to Theresienstadt because that's where the Red Cross were. That's where survivors are going from everywhere. And one of them I know, Robert Rinder's quite a celebrity here. Judge Rinder, well, his grandfather, Moshe, was wandering around Prague, didn't know what to do with himself next. And he met one of the boys. And Koppel said, what are you going to do? I have no idea. I've been home. They don't want me. I don't know where I'm going. And Koppel said, well, just come with me. We're in a flight to England. And Koppel said, yeah, but you've got to be 15. And Moshe said, well, I can't. I'm 22. And Koppel said, well, just say you're 15. I am. so they went. So it really was. Some of them, we know in the early days that some of them, quite genuinely, having been in camps and ghettos, separated from parents, couldn't remember how old they were. Were you 14, 15? I don't know, whatever, it'll do. Even now, we have some of the boys and the girls, and some of the second gen don't know how old the fathers and mothers were. Well, he said he was this old, but I found out he's this old. And he may have been this old. A lot of it is to do with survival. That you say whatever's necessary, and you had to, when you were being selected to go into a camp. I've heard this many times in Auschwitz. You had to listen out for what trade was useful to them, and be that. What are you? I'm a master tailor, not just a tailor. Tailor's a 10 a penny. A master tailor, all right, that could save your life. And how old were you? And you would keep an eye on what they were saying. If you were too young, you would be sent away. If you're too old, you'd be sent away. They're looking. So you had to sort of say, you could be 14. Would be good in one circumstance. Maybe 16 would be better in another one. So a lot of you know that you had to play the game, and you had to be shrewd in this, and you had to not be beyond, as I know in one case, being selected to go to the gas chamber, realize where that queue was going, and as it's walking on its way, leap out back into the queue that wasn't, and hope to goodness you weren't spotted.
Yeah.
And he wasn't spotted, and he ended up going into the barrack block where he should have gone to the. You had to have you took tremendous risks. So these are stories which these are told often sort of late at night having a chat, and then you get the real insight into how what a survival story it was, you know, with moments like that. So does that help, Ed? I hope that helps.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. We'll take a couple more, and then I want to be cognizant of everybody's time today. George, and then Esther. Well, George unmutes. My dad also had 2 different birth years, we think.
Okay. Yeah.
Trevor, a month before the arrival at Windermere, there was a general election in the United Kingdom in which Winston Churchill lost, and a new prime minister by the name of Clement Attlee took over. And he was, and I'll choose my words carefully, he was suspected of being quite anti-Semitic. Did that have any effect on the your plans for bringing the children over? Was there any resistance from that government? Because you did make some sort of allusion to the alluded to some sort of government restrictions.
The permanent secretary was a chap named Alexander, and what I've learned with this is you can have a government policy,
yes,
but within that, if an individual, and it can happen in a school can have a policy, but to teach about the education, Holocaust education, but not do it until a teacher takes it upon themselves to do it. Mm-hmm. And in this instance, the government had to be persuaded to receive these Jewish children, without, because they didn't have identification. There were aspects of it which could be construed as being anti-Semitic. It's another talk for another time. But the British government, the concern I've always had for a while is we need to be very careful about the Windermere story, that it becomes a story of how wonderful Britain was to the Jewish people during the war. And actually, it wasn't. It's a complex story. Could have done an awful lot more. But in this instance, and it was this permanent secretary, Alexander, and the reason why he stipulated the age range from 8 to 15. So when he got the list that children as young as 3 had come in and as old as 22, you could feel it in his letter. He's frightened of being found out. You know, that he's doing this in so many words. He's kind of doing it on his own. Sort of, he's a high-ranking civil servant rather than a member of parliament, and he's doing this. We call it here pushing the envelope a bit. It's by accepting them, and he's a little bit frightened that if too much attention was raised to what he was doing, it could backfire on him and backfire. And you realise that with Leonard Montefiore, that most of these children really were en route to somewhere else. You know, that they were allowed into Britain, but it wasn't particularly envisaged that they would settle here. Many of them were en route to Palestine. Well, we know what was happening in Palestine at that time. So the whole thing was a very, very fluid arrangement about getting them out of there, and then having got here, many of them had to ask permission in the 50s. They had to come clean when they wanted to get married or settle here. They had to literally sort of get an amnesty, permission to stay, and that you had to apply for that. It wasn't. We're beginning to drill down into that sort of aspect of it. It wasn't a straightforward process at all. And I think, if I'm really honest, a lot of the people, we can now look into what the carers and the people behind it, the Leonard Montefiore. I'm in touch with the Montefiore family, find out Leonard's motivation and how he worked. And those guys deserve enormous credit for playing the system to get this through at all. For anybody who's had anything whatsoever to do with bureaucracies and getting them to shift, now I have in my own small way, that is a skill in itself, and is huge determination. And I think that the response was when Mr. Alexander got this list of names, and he sort of said, wait a minute, I told you nobody under the age of 8 and nobody over 15. What have you done? What have you done? And I think the letter back is something along the lines of, oh, really? I didn't realise. I need to check. Of course they knew. In fact, on a very brief story, on the airport at Prague, as our 300 children are climbing on board the aeroplanes, on the last aeroplane, the so-called men from the ministry in the Czech Republic, Czechoslovakia, turned up at the airport, running onto the airfield, and George Lauer, one of the people, had a briefcase, and they were running out trying to stop the flights taking off. We need to check the names. We need to check the names. Who have you got? Who have you not got? And George tells in his story how he took a random few papers from a briefcase, and as the last of the aircraft turned, as its propellers came, he held the papers up and he said to these guys, these are the list of names. He let go of the papers, and the propeller just blew them across the airfield. With these bureaucrats chasing after them, trying to catch it. And George shouted to the others, just get on the planes and go. You know, so you have all this going on, and you have a group of children turning up, which is really sad. As these planes take off, a man arrives at Prague airport with another group of children, too late to get them out. You know, so you have the drama of it is the personal stories behind it are quite, they're very, very dramatic things. And it's you know, there's the cover story, which is 300 children, survivors of the Holocaust, were from liberating Theresienstadt, flown to Crosby and Eden, came to Windermere Paradise. My goodness me, there's a multitude of nuances behind that, but that's how we encapsulate it.
Esther, we'll take two last questions, one from Esther and one from Miriam, who has her hand up as well.
What happened to the bunch of 3-year-olds? Because that program wasn't set up for children so young.
No, it was interesting. We had the very great misfortune. Well, she's misfortune that she passed away. But we had the fortune of meeting one of the nurses who were in Windsor, who looked after them. She came to see us. She said they'd been in Theresienstadt. This is a different story. They could have a drama all to themselves, their story. A lot of the older teenagers don't remember them at all. They were teenage boys and girls. They did their thing. And these little tiny ones, they'd largely been in Theresienstadt for a number of years. They probably have gone in either from an orphanage, or they've been hidden, or they'd gone in with a Jewish mother who'd perished. And they've been kept alive in Theresienstadt by other women and looked after. So most of the children that came to Windermere, they'd all been in camps across the whole of Europe. They've been slave labor. And actually, they all kind of came, as the Nazi war system broke down, they just emptied the camps, and a lot of them just fetched up in Theresienstadt. They were liberated in Theresienstadt on trains. Or at the very end of the war, they came there. We now know that there were probably plans to kill them all, get their gas chambers prepared at Theresienstadt. But thankfully, the camp was liberated before they could kick them into gear. So these little tiny ones have been in for 2 or 3 years. And when they came to Windermere, they were putting their own house, their little thing. But the lady who came to see us, she was the nurse in charge of it. She worked for UNRWA, which is the United Nations Relief Agency. And she said we couldn't take them we only took them off the estate once into the village. We couldn't handle them. They were feral, they were absolutely, bursting. And actually, in fact, then they only stayed there. They very quickly made arrangements for them to go to a place called Bulldogs Banks in the south of England. And this was sort of run by Anna Freud was there. She wrote a very famous study of these children being in Bulldogs Banks. And it's with the Freud Museum in London. And she starts it by saying, this isn't so much a study because it's unprecedented what we have. This is more of an observation. So she observes their behavior. She sees how they are. The one story we have in Windermere, we have a few, but we know that unlike, there's a famous book, Lord of the Flies. And if the adults aren't there, the children fall into a kind of anarchy without adults around. Well, actually, these children had a very ferocious bond with each other, because if you can imagine in Theresienstadt, they're in a room, and then the women who are looking after them then have to go out to do slave labor work. So they're locked in a room together all day until the women can go back at night time and entertain them. So these children are absolutely locked in these circumstances. So freedom to them, the outdoors, is that's why they couldn't cope with Windermere out. It was it was just too much information going in. So she studied them, and it's remarkable how quickly she said what they disturbed, really disturbing behaviour. But if one of them got a treat, it could be if one of them got a donut, they would have a complete meltdown. They'd lose their temper until they all got one. What I'm saying is it wasn't every man for himself. It was quite the opposite. If one's going for a walk, I'm not going unless they come as well, And there was one famous incident described, which this lady told us about, and it's in Anna Freud's book. They were all playing in Windermere, and they were having a pillow fight, just laughing and joking. A bunch of children, 3 years old to maybe 6, 7, 8 years old. And then suddenly, the carers are in the next room, suddenly it all goes very quiet. And think, what's happened here? This isn't good. So they went into the room, and they found in the room the 6 children all huddled together in one ball for comfort. And the room had one of the pillars had burst, and the feathers were falling down. And the suspicion is that 1 or 2 of the children, it had some echo memory of ashes coming down from a camp.
Yeah.
They can't be sure, but the interesting reaction was how they were all in one huge bundle to comfort each other. And that's in Anna Freud's book. And the lady who came to see us, she told us this story. She was one of the people who dashed in. They couldn't figure out what had gone on, and then they suddenly realised what it was. So yeah, the little ones, and in later lives, it's fair to, I do know many of them, Joanna and Jackie, and they'll say themselves, they faced a different challenge from the older guys. They faced more identity challenges. They were, even when they came here, they were often adopted, and with some of the adoptive parents they were doing it with the best intention, didn't tell them where they come from, didn't tell them what their experiences were. I don't think it was done in a conspiratorial way. It was done to try and have a normality of life. And then I know one of them was told at 12 years old by somebody else in the school playground, you were adopted, you were in a concentration camp, you were this, that, and the other. And you imagine the shock. He ran home to his adopted parents. I've just been told, So, and I know another of them, and she was a lovely lady, Judith. And she was 4 years old when she came to Windermere. And not until she was, it was partly through a project our project got some sort of a big story in one of the national newspapers. And she read this story and she basically passed out in front of her daughter and her children in Manchester. And they said, "Mom, what's wrong with you?" And they opened the newspaper and they saw a photograph of this little girl with her hands in the air in Windermere, laughing and joking. And her daughter, Alison, said, "That looks like Mom." And she turned to her mum and she said, "Is there something you'd like to tell us?" And her mum had never told the family any of her background as to where she come from. These are complex questions that leave a legacy, not only with the first generation, but on the children. They've got to come to terms with this. It's a huge learning curve to think your mum was, adopted a lovely parents, and then you find out what your mum's story was. And then you're on the journey of trying to find out who their parents were. And that often trail runs cold for the little ones.
Thank you.
It just does.
Miriam, last question of the day. I don't think we can hear you. There's something with your audio. Could you type it in the chat or try again? It's not working.
Can you hear me now?
Oh, there you go.
Okay, sorry about that. No, I wanted to thank Avery for the presentation, but I just wondered for some contextual information. How many child survivors were there in Europe, and did any other countries do anything similar? I mean, my gut feeling is that the US didn't do very much. And so I was just curious if you have any more information in general.
I'm by no means an expert. I do come across, there is a famous case of France taking children, and I've come across a place, a suburb of Warsaw that took Jewish child survivors. It's a very difficult story to know the numbers. We're presuming that the ones that did survive, the ones that came to Windermere, one of the stipulations, these were the guys who'd been in the camps and survived the camps. Many of those, and many of the survivors that emerged, they'd been in hiding. They'd been in, we know the example I give of a couple of our children, the smaller children, their families had given them to Christian families to hide during the war. And then for whatever reason, at some instant, they've either taken fright or something's happened and they've handed them over to the authorities. And that's how they ended up in Theresienstadt. But this particular child didn't bear any bad feeling towards his Christian family. Hid him for 2 years. It was sort of, so the numbers are very, very strange, but France certainly did. Poland, it's an evolving story. It really is I think I focus on, the interesting thing for us was that Leonard Montefiore felt that the children, the young people we take in, or Britain took in, had to have been in the camps because he felt they needed the most help, because he'd started to meet concentration camp survivors. The word Holocaust wasn't around then, but he'd met concentration camp survivors in France when he was over there. And interestingly, he said he gave us 2 reasons why in the first letter he wrote back to his headquarters in Bloomsbury. One, on compassionate grounds, of course, but the second reason was to show the British people in the future why we fought the war. And there's no better way of doing that than to have these examples living amongst us, these survivors. Now, he wrote that in May 1945. Well, if you see the contribution, I know in the States, and certainly this country, that survivors have given to keeping the memory of the Holocaust alive, and how forward-thinking he was. I don't think he would, I know I said to Maya Hirsch before he passed away, we stood in a field in Calgarth in the Lake District, and I said to Maya, did you ever think, so many years later, that you'd be having to tell your story, and there would be some people who denied it happened, and you'd see the rise of anti-Semitism? He said, no, she said, Trevor, after what we survived when we came out of the camps, we thought, surely to goodness, the world has learned its lesson. Surely to goodness. And he said, and here we are today. But he said, it's why I do what I do. We can't give in. We can't let it happen again, you know. So they're very aware of it. They're aware of the changes. One or two of them, interestingly, went after Windermere, went to a hostel here, got a job in London. It's only 2 years after his liberation, and he went for a job in a factory in London. And one of the guys in London said to him then, it's only 2 years after liberation, it can't have been that bad if you survived. And that shocked him. But you know, these elements have always been there, you know, to me. This sort of, but I say from where we are in Windermere, this remote little part north of England, without a Jewish community, to bring these boys and girls up to talk to these children, we've been doing it for so many years now. It's you won't find many people. Well, the first children now we spoke to 16 years ago would have been, those children now will be in their early 30s, 31, 32. So they've grown up. So we think of it like that exponentially. And they hand it on to their children. So there won't be many who went to the Lake School who will have an attitude like that. And that's really the bottom line, is what the legacy that the boys wanted. They most of them will say, do you want a monument, or do you want a sculpture, or do you want a thing? So most of them say education, education. So that's really at the end of all this, that's really, I wanted to make sure, myself and my colleagues wanted to make sure that people learned this story. That's education at every level, but particularly young people.
For all of us as well. I can't thank you enough for sharing the stories.
My pleasure.
Many of our parents who are here today, and also the stories of so many others who I've heard about and we've met, and I can't thank you enough for sharing your story with us and taking the time to do this today. We will. I want to thank everybody else for joining us as well. I will keep the conversation on a bit for those who wish to stay a bit longer, and I wish everyone a good day.
Thank you, Mark, and thank you, Trevor. An amazing program.
Wow, look at you.